Billionaire CEO steps into his car. A black little girl suddenly tells him to be quiet. The reason shocked him. The rain had only just stopped when Billionaire CEO Richard Hayes stepped out of the towering glass building that carried his name. His presence was commanding, and his life was always surrounded by people who listened to him without question. The black limousine waited, its polished surface reflecting the city lights, and as always, Richard slipped inside with the quiet expectation that the world would move exactly as he commanded. He was ready to give his usual list of instructions to the driver when an unexpected sound broke the rhythm of his life. A small voice, soft but firm, saying, "Shh, please don't talk." Richard froze, his eyes snapping to the corner of the car where a little black girl, no older than 7, sat curled up with her arms wrapped tightly around a worn backpack. Her wide eyes held no fear of him, only urgency, as though silence itself could save her. Richard had built his empire on control, and no one ever dared interrupt him, much less order him to be quiet. His first instinct was a spark of anger, but it vanished as quickly as it came when he saw her trembling hands gripping the backpack like her life depended on it. For a long moment, he said nothing, only staring at her as the driver glanced nervously in the mirror. Who was she? How had she gotten into his car? The girl shook her head, as if she could hear the questions forming in his mind, and whispered again, "Please, don't say anything." The way she spoke, desperate and deliberate, made Richard lean back in silence, an unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest. Uncertainty. The car glided through the city streets, but Richard's mind was no longer on meetings, contracts, or the millions of dollars shifting in his accounts. It was on the little girl who sat beside him, clutching her belongings as though the world was hunting her. After several minutes of heavy silence, she tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "They're looking for me. If you talk, they'll hear." Richard felt his heart skip. This wasn't a game. There was a real fear in her voice that no child should carry. She explained in broken sentences that she had run away from the orphanage because dangerous men had been following her. She didn't know where to go, so when she saw the open limousine door, she had climbed in, hoping it might be the safest place. Richard Hayes, the man who once thought nothing could shake him, sat speechless. A child had silenced him, not with power or wealth, but with the weight of her fear and innocence. Something shifted inside him in that moment, something he hadn't felt in years. He gave the driver new orders, not to his office, not to a meeting, but to his own home. As the car turned, Richard realized this encounter was not an interruption. It was a reminder. The little girl who had told him to be quiet had awakened a part of him he had long buried: compassion, humility, and the courage to protect someone who had no one else. Richard leaned back against the leather seat, his jaw tightening as he tried to make sense of the situation. He was a man who demanded answers immediately, and yet here he was, staring at a little girl who refused to speak beyond those strange words. "Please, just be quiet." Her voice carried both fear and authority, an odd combination that unsettled him. He glanced at the driver in the rearview mirror, but the man only gave him a helpless shrug, his eyes as confused as Richard's own. The air inside the limousine grew heavy, the silence pressing against him in a way he had never experienced. Richard was used to filling rooms with his commands, his booming voice, his decisive tone. Now, for the first time in years, he found himself obeying the words of a child. He studied her closely. She was small, her shoes scuffed, her jacket too thin for the evening chill, and her tiny fingers gripped that old backpack as if it held the last piece of safety she had in the world. He noticed her eyes darting toward the tinted windows, following the city lights as they streaked by. But behind that watchfulness was terror. Richard tried again, his voice lower this time, asking gently who she was and how she had ended up in his car, but she pressed her lips together and shook her head. Her eyes glistened with tears she was trying hard not to shed, and that simple defiance pulled at something inside him. For a moment, he felt strangely powerless. The billionaire who dictated the futures of entire companies suddenly had no control over a single child. He realized that raising his voice or demanding answers would break her fragile trust completely, and so he fell into an uneasy silence. The limousine hummed quietly as it moved through the streets, but each passing block only deepened his suspicion that something was very wrong. He could feel her fear like a pulse in the air, quick and unrelenting. As minutes passed, Richard caught her staring at the darkened corners of the city through the glass, shrinking into her seat whenever the car slowed. She seemed to expect someone, to appear at any moment, someone she desperately wanted to avoid. His mind raced with possibilities. Had she run away from home? Was she in some kind of danger? Why had she chosen his car, of all places, to slip into? Questions swirled, but no answers came. Only the sight of a little girl trying to disappear inside herself while holding on to the only thing she had, her battered bag. Richard shifted uncomfortably. He had faced hostile boardrooms, ruthless, rivals, and international negotiations worth billions. Yet this 7-year-old's silence unnerved him more than all of them. For the first time in years, he felt like a passenger in his own life, watching events unfold without any control, carried forward by a mystery that refused to reveal itself. The limousine rolled past the dimly lit streets, and Richard felt the little girl's hand clutch at his sleeve, her small fingers trembling as she pulled him down toward her level. In a hurried whisper, she begged him not to let them see her, her eyes wide with a terror that pierced through his hardened exterior. Richard turned his gaze toward the window and noticed a group of shadowy figures lingering near a dark alley, their heads swiveling as though they were searching for someone. The girl quickly ducked, hiding her face against the seat, and whispered with a broken voice, "They're looking for me. Please don't let them find me." A chill ran through Richard, one he hadn't felt in decades, not even in the most ruthless of boardroom battles. This wasn't a spoiled child playing tricks. This was fear in its purest form, raw and desperate, the kind that only came from real danger. He steadied his voice, softer now, and asked her who they were, trying not to alarm her further. Tears welled in her eyes as she explained that she had run away from the orphanage earlier that morning, her small voice breaking as she admitted she couldn't stay there anymore. The men who had been following her weren't strangers. They were dangerous people who knew how to frighten children into silence, and she had no one to protect her. She had run through the streets until her legs burned, searching for any place to hide, and when she saw the open limousine door, she took her chance, hoping maybe a car that looked so powerful would also be safe. Richard felt his chest tighten, each word cutting deeper than the last. He had spent his entire life building walls of wealth and control around himself, convinced nothing could touch him. Yet this little girl had slipped through all of it and awakened a part of him he thought had died long ago. He studied her face, streaked with tears, and realized she had no one in the world. Her story wasn't a plea for pity. It was a plea for safety, for a chance to breathe without fear. Richard's instincts as a businessman told him to call security, to remove her from the situation, to restore the order he lived by. But his instincts as a man, long buried under years of ambition, told him something different. They told him to protect her. He had seen countless people beg for his attention, his money, his influence, yet no one had ever needed him the way she did in this moment. For the first time in years, Richard felt something stir inside him that money couldn't buy and power couldn't command, a deep, protective resolve. He realized he was no longer looking at a child who had invaded his car. He was looking at a child who had found him for a reason, a child who had forced him into silence not to control him, but to survive. Richard leaned forward in his seat, his decision forming faster than his own thoughts could keep up. For years he had been a man who chose efficiency over emotion, results over relationships. But in this moment, none of those rules mattered. He looked at the driver, his voice steady but carrying a weight it hadn't in years, and said, "We're not going to the office. Take us home." The driver's eyes widened in surprise, but he obeyed without hesitation. The little girl, her face pale from fear, lifted her gaze toward Richard as if trying to read his true intention. She looked ready to run again at the first sign of betrayal, yet there was a flicker of hope in her eyes that told him she wanted desperately to believe. When the limousine pulled up the long driveway to his sprawling mansion, Richard felt a wave of contradiction. He had always built this place as a fortress of power, a display of his achievements. But now he wondered if it could become a sanctuary for someone who needed protection more than he had ever needed wealth. As they stepped inside, the staff rushed to greet him, prepared for their usual tasks, but Richard raised a hand to silence their rehearsed questions. He ordered them to prepare a warm meal, fresh clothes, and a room for the girl. The staff exchanged startled looks. This was not their employer's way, but they obeyed. The girl clutched her backpack tightly, her small body tense as though any moment she might be cast out again. But when she was led to the dining room and a plate of food was placed in front of her, her hands shook as she lifted the fork. Richard stood at a distance, watching the simple act of her eating as though it was a miracle. To him, it was. This child wasn't demanding money, favors, or influence. She was simply surviving, and in her survival, he saw something greater than all the empires he had built. Later that night, after she had bathed and changed into clean clothes, Richard found her sitting at the edge of the guest bed, the backpack still beside her like a trusted friend. He sat across from her, lowering himself into a chair with an ease that surprised him. He asked her name, her story, and this time she answered. Slowly, haltingly, she told him about the orphanage, the fear, the men who had followed her, and the endless feeling of being unwanted. Richard listened, truly listened, something he hadn't done for anyone in years. Every word struck him deeper, peeling away the layers of arrogance and pride he had built around himself. He realized this little girl hadn't only slipped into his car. She had slipped into his life at the very moment he needed her most. She had reminded him that all the wealth in the world meant nothing without compassion. By the time she finished, he knew his life would never be the same. She had silenced more than his voice in the car. She had silenced his arrogance, his indifference, and his loneliness. In return, he would give her something priceless: safety, family, and the promise of a future where she would never again have to beg anyone to keep her safe.